All right, so welcome to the presentation, FME Governance, How to Structure the Use and Growth of FME. I'm Leslie. I'll be the main presenter today, but I have Holly from SAFE and Brian from SAFE as well, and we'll all three of us, thank you, Holly. I didn't give you the secret key, but you read my mind.
That's okay.
We'll be presenting together and different ideas towards sort of how to look at FME Server from a more enterprise point of view when we're implementing it. So you want to hit next. All right. So today's objective is how do we approach implementing FME as an enterprise application? So it's really an overview of considerations and questions to ask yourself when planning an FME server or for an upgrade or how to manage your FME server. And we're going to cover all the different facets of it, and it's really about asking yourself the different questions, and it's really sort of a first go or first presentation at this type of content. We've been installing FME Server for a long time and sort of had to develop a methodology for it over many years, and now we're sort of looking to see how we can put some practices and guides on how to approach this topic. Next. So this is just a quote that I built at one point for a client that we did do recently a governance exercise with. There is enough room in the sandbox for all the castles, but we have to agree on how to share the sand. So the idea just being that FME Server is, it's a powerful tool, and it's flexible. It can be expanded to meet whatever needs you have for it. But we do have to agree on, everybody has to sort of have the same idea of, how they're going to use it to be able to be effective with it. So next. So this is just the overview of the presentation. So the way we're going to present is that I'm going to present the ideas and the concepts, and then Brian or Holly will kind of jump in and show some things in FME Server or resources people can have to connect to this, to be able to get more information on the specific topics I'll be mentioning. So, we're going to start with what are the challenges, the business and technical, what are the benefits of governance and implementation, what is in a plan, and, it's mostly about covering, like I said, the questions and considerations. It's really like a sort of a first level of what does this look like from the outside, what are the main components of this. Next. We'll start with like a short history. FME Server has existed since 2008, and I'm saying that in front of Safe Software people, so I don't know what if I've got the number right, but that's the earliest I remember seeing it, unless we think of its precursor, Spatial Direct. Maybe it existed in 2007. See, this I'm not sure. I'll have to get my historical facts straight. But it's been around for over 10 years now. And the thing is, FME Server especially grew, and even FME Desktop, usage of FME technology grew organically in most organizations. So, people would get an FME Server and put one project on it, and that went well, and then they would add another, and they would add another over time. It wasn't an application that people went in with a structured approach or a plan. It sort of grew organically, and it tended to be managed by only a few individuals in an organization, usually a GIS department, usually on some little hidden server somewhere, and managed by people who really didn't just know FME Desktop well, but were really like masters of FME Desktop a lot of the time. And that sort of led to different kinds of challenges. Next. So what were the challenges for these existing FME servers over time? These are things that we've run into with clients, quality control issues. So duplicate processes, version 1, version 2, version 3, they're not named so nicely, and then we don't know which is the good one anymore. Orphaned items, so subscriptions and notification services items that are just no longer being called by anything or attached to anything. And processes that are difficult to read. So you try to see what it's doing, but it's not clear what it's reading, what it's writing, where all the dependencies are going. So, I mean, it's literally happened. I'd say in the past like 5 years or so that we've had to sit down with several clients who sort of like let their FME server grow organically and sort of literally sit down, go through all the content with them. Is this workspace still good? Okay, this one's called by scheduled task. This other one, do you ever run it? And really have to go through the process of cleaning up the FME server and figuring out what's good. Staff turnover is another challenge. Staff turnover is a challenge because the original people who bought the FME server and implemented it are now often not the people who are currently managing it, because it's been well over 10 years now. People have upgraded their FME servers and they've moved on with it. But the truth is that often, you know, staff moves around with time. And so now we have new people managing a tool. Inefficient scheduling and engine management. I mean, obviously the technology has really improved a lot over the last few years for doing this. But, you know, people sort of schedule tasks any which way. There was originally a lot of room on the FME server. And, you know, people found themselves scheduling, they would schedule something at 1:15 a.m. and then schedule something at 1:18 a.m., but then leave a 2-minute gap. And that made some sense, except that then they ended up with, you know, a server that looked super busy. But when we actually sat down and, you know, analyzed the data of the processes, realized the server's only processing about 8 hours a day. So if we optimize the schedules, we actually have room for quite a bit more processing. Permissions and security issues, and like I said, migration. Next. I almost pressed the next arrow. So that's for the existing organizations. For new ones, I'm finding the challenges with new organizations are that they're adopting FME server in an enterprise way much faster. So now we're not dealing with people who know the ins and outs of mastering FME desktop that are then buying server after many years, but organizations saying, okay, we're implementing FME, and that means server and desktop and everything that goes with it. So they're having to they have a much shorter uptime at being able to learn all these different technologies and how they work together and master them. So it takes a more organized approach if you're going in with a much shorter time frame of trying to deploy desktop and server, let's say. And FME also has way more deployment options than ever had before. There are options on the cloud if you want to do, use Azure. There are templates available. There's containerization. There are dynamic engines and static engines. All these different options, though, mean more complexity in choosing, what meets your organization's needs. Next. So for us, we've been approaching in implementing FME server with our clients now more from both a governance and implementation approach. So sort of to cover more facets of just, not just install FME server and then, oh, it's great. We only have to think about it in a few years from now. We really take a much more measured approach to implementing FME server now, and then we'll sort of talk about the different facets of that. Next. So what are the key elements? We grouped them to keep it simple. We grouped it into like 3 main components. I wish I kept my boxes all the same sizes. They are not like sized according to their importance. They're sized according to the number of letters in the box. But so we have technology, and the people and the standards. So the technology is everything from the IT components like the networking, the VMs or the machines, the environment, the FME server itself, how we install it, how we configure it, the people. This is really largely around roles and responsibilities, access to the FME server, what kind of skills and competencies are required to manage and run the FME server. And then standards, how do we leverage the technology? So what are the rules in place for how we're using it? I put security on the side in this graphic because it does impact how we will implement the technology. It impacts how people will access it, and it impacts how we're going to use the technology. Next. And then I did it from a different perspective here. So I wanted to give a few different ways you could look at this. So I split technology into IT practices and technology, because there's FME, its technology and how it works and how it's configured. But that also has to be paired with how my organization does IT. What are the standards and practices of IT in general in my organization. This will have a big impact on what I can and can't do with my FME server or how I set it up. Then I left in the people and the standards, I added security, but the thing that I added that's really important to point out is really the business needs, because they sort of drive all the other pieces of that pie, right? At the end of the day, it's a very flexible tool that can do just about anything, but what you're going to want to do with it is really what's going to drive how you use it, how you implement it, and security. Next. So we've kind of come up with a good rule of thumb for people implementing their first FME server. I'm usually asking them literally the question, what are you planning on doing in the next 6 to 12 months? And we really do the exercise of writing these out literally and prioritizing them, but seeing this as sort of a living document. And this question is really what's going to drive all of the other facets of the governance, of the implementation. So we see this as a living plan. Sometimes people have a list. Some of our clients have a list of like 30, 35 integrations that they desire to build. We sort of prioritize them. It becomes the living roadmap of what we're planning on doing. Next. So yes, like I said, the key driver is business needs. So what are you planning on doing with your FME server? Like I said, how you're going to architect it, install it, what kind of licenses, it's all related to what you want to do with the FME server. A lot of the time we have clients come and ask us, okay, I want to do FME server. And we're like, okay, great. What do you want to do with it? We don't know. We have these like big visions for it. Okay. Maybe describe some of the processes. And the thing is that we have to start from something. And if we can start from something, then we can actually then, build flexibility into it, build the possibility of expanding it, and we can answer all those questions. Next. So we start with, like I said, sort of an integrations roadmap. And, for us, we like to identify these key facts. So we start with, what are the key projects and what kind of integrations will there be? And so actually, sometimes we do a little bit of a lesson when we do this exercise on teaching what are the main kinds of integrations that we see with FME servers. So we see scheduled tasks, predictable, repeatable processes, on demand or apps. So that's users requesting FME to run processes on demand, and automation. That's more the connection between two different applications that happen on the back end between things. And that leads itself to webhooks and more real-time type processes. So, each of them has different ways of being triggered and different frequencies that they might be run at. And sometimes you have to be able to make a hypothesis at this stage. Like sometimes people say, but I don't know how popular my workspace on demand will be. We can maybe make an assumption and then test that hypothesis and then adapt from there. Next. And then step 2, based on this list of projects, we tend to prioritize them based on different kinds of considerations. So like, for instance, we'll say, is the data ready? Sometimes people have a project they want to do, but they actually won't have access to the data for 6 more months. Okay, that one gets shelved for the next 6 months. So we do an exercise of prioritization. Is the process understood? Do we have some process work to do before we can start to design a solution? All these questions lead us to make a priority list, and also to ask the other really important question, which is what data and systems do we want to connect to? Because this answers a lot of questions that we have coming on. I believe, Holly.
Yeah, I can jump in here, Leslie. So one of the things that you're bringing up there is a really good question. And part of this process, you're trying to define where is FME going to play and what is it going to work with. And sometimes it's not always clear that FME can actually do the thing you're thinking of doing because we don't list it in a format gallery or it's not listed on the website. But there are so many ways in to connecting applications together and using FME that I just wanted to point this out because I think it's really critical at this planning stage. So there's a few different ways you can access systems that are not true formats of FME. In databases in particular, I see this all the time where a database system is out there and they have a JDBC driver that you can use to connect to it. We may not list that format, but we have a JDBC format that you can use, and right away you've now got connectivity to that database that you may not have thought you had before. Similar APIs, there's so many software as a service systems out there that have APIs into them. Again, we may not list it as a format that we support, but building a connection and utilizing that API is quite easy to do inside FME. And so, yeah, I think it's just a key point is when you're assessing exactly what you want to do a little bit of extra research into some of those systems that you maybe think FME can't touch, because I think in many cases we can do it. So yeah, just have a look there.
That is a good point. That is a good point, Brian. Thanks.
Yeah, and on the next slide, I think I have a few resources too on this section. So the first one, this again gets into this planning discussion, is FME subscriptions are a really great way that you can define the exact needs of your organization without a lot of back and forth with procurement and costing, because it allows you to find that real sweet spot, that niche of where FME is going to fit. And you don't have to worry about pulling in extra engines and extra desktop licenses and those sorts of things. So definitely check out the subscription offerings that are out there, because it just makes these initial stages so much easier. And then generally, the knowledge base on safe.com is a great place to go. I'll put a link into the chat. But for many of the things we're going to talk about today, we do have articles and links and pieces that can help you out through there. So for example, I've got the doc, just planning your installation doc. And again, we go into detail here, but we don't go into the level of detail that you're talking about, Leslie, which is really like the key considerations that you need to make. And that's why I really love this talk, and I'll pass it back over to you.
All right. So yeah, so the important thing that we wanted to start with was asking that question, asking those questions. What do we want to do with the FME server? What do we want to connect to? And then that leads us to being able to figure out our governance and implementation plan. So next. Cool. So now that I know what I want to do with my FME server, this will help me answer the questions. How many engines? But now not just how many engines, perhaps what type of engines? Do I need dynamic engines? Do I need, and again, it comes back to that business need. If I need to have high availability of my FME server, do I need to distribute my architecture for different technical reasons? Do I need to be ready to add a whole lot of new engines at a moment's notice? Do I need containerization? What do I need to be able to run? And for a first FME server, I'm usually looking at the first 6 to 12 months, because we're usually planning an upgrade after 1 year. And the reason we want to do that is because we're still usually light in our usage of our FME server after 1 year, and we want to keep up with the technology as much as we can, and also develop a good methodology for keeping up with the technology. I would say the sweet spot is to upgrade every year or two. If you can, that would be my recommendation. I would say my average clients were in the 2-year range, but I have some that are in 3 and I have some that are in 4. I really don't recommend 4 unless organizationally you have no choice. When we get to 4, we get to a lot of delta between different versions, and it becomes more challenging. You have to first analyze the differences between the applications to see if you have to re-architect pieces. When we're in the 1 to 2 year, we're adapting smaller bits at a time. But again, it sort of depends on a lot of considerations. Next.
Okay.
Thanks. I believe this is your part.
Yeah. So thanks, Leslie. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here and talk a little bit more about licensing and your initial options for scaling your FME server. So when we really talk about scaling, the number one consideration that we're talking about is adding engines to your FME server. And this is something that's going to enable you to process more jobs in parallel so that you can support a higher volume of jobs over that same time frame. So actually, I thought here it would be great to mention the talk that Don and Laura and Grant did last week on pushing FME server to the limits. And they basically challenged themselves with trying to perform a year's worth of processing in a single hour, and they were able to achieve this by simply launching 1,000 engines on a single FME server. So obviously that's a little bit excessive for what most people's needs probably are, But more engines is basically how you're going to scale your FME server. And there are two types of engines that are available on FME Server. And functionally, these are equivalent, but they do differ in their pricing model. So it's definitely something for you to consider when you're first architecting your FME server as well. So there's two types of engines. The first type is standard engines. And these are a one-time cost for a single engine. And then we also have dynamic engines, which you purchase through credits. And so credits equate to a number of CPU hours. And then you can launch an unlimited number of engines, and your credits will dial down as you make use of CPU time on these engines. So because of these two different pricing models, we really want you to ask the question, why do you actually need to scale? And why do you need to add additional engines to your FME server? And depending on what that answer is, you're going to be leaning towards a different engine type. So for our standard engine, since this is a fixed processing power, these are kind of ideal for users that have predictable and consistent workloads, whereas dynamic engines, because they're sold by the CPU hour, they're more ideal for these unpredictable workloads. Perhaps you've got streaming of data or seasonal inputs where you don't need the consistent processing power. And you can also start to use these in combination as well for ultimate flexibility. But yeah, definitely. So thinking about the type of engine, and again, going back to what are your jobs actually doing is going to be really important in looking at scaling your FME server as well. And back to you, Leslie, if I can change the slide. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so so we choose our types of engines, our types of licenses, and what we need. You know, now we need to think about how we need to configure the FME server. So all these bits fall into that technology part of my governance and implementation plan. So what licensing we need, what we're going to install, all driven by what we want to do in that business driver of our FME server. So the things we're looking at in configuration is often like, do I have custom content, like coordinate system grid shift files? You know, do I have special software dependencies? A lot of people forget that all the things that are deployed on their FME desktop machine to make their workspace run are going to be necessary on their FME server. If they're using the Oracle driver-based readers to Oracle, you're going to need to install the Oracle client on the FME server as well. If your workspace uses R, you probably need to install R. You might need some sort of Esri licensing. You might need a special version of Python if you're using something that's not shipped with the FME server. So you need to think about what are my workspaces doing? What are they connecting to? And is there special content? Because I'm going to need to make sure my FME server is set up with it. Next. And then the next facet, so that was the technology facet, and then we look at the people part. And this is something that, let's say, like, our implementation plans have been largely focused on technology the last few years, so it became a lot of what do you want to do with the FME server. We even have a questionnaire that we will sit with clients through on a first install, literally asking, what do you want to do with your FME server, and going through all those things that I mentioned. But more and more, we're also looking at this people aspect even right at the beginning because of this more uptake, quicker uptake of FME server and FME desktop. So we're asking a lot more questions around roles and responsibilities of the FME server. So this is not just what rights you have, what like software permissions you have, but whose job is it to make sure FME server is up and running? Whose job is it to you know, prioritize tasks? Is it a committee? Is it a team? Are they going to meet once a month? Like, we have to actually have these conversations and put these things into place. And also more and more, we're starting to develop guidelines for skills requirements. So as we see people, you know, onboard new people, or people change departments or organizations, we have new people that have to come in and take charge of the FME server or use the FME server. So we want to develop some guidelines as to what skills they should acquire. And this often includes a mix of like different kinds of training and things that we would recommend that they go take, for instance. Next. And this is just an example of like an actual like exercise in roles and responsibilities that we did with a client. Like, so, like for instance, the FME administrator is responsible for, installing, configuring, and maintaining and upgrading the FME server and managing user access and, actually identifying the roles and responsibilities. So like often we start with roles and responsibilities that pretty much mimic Safe Software's built-in roles and responsibilities, and then we add or adjust those as needed for an organization. Sometimes a kind of an FME server architect role kind of squeezes itself between FME admin and FME author, let's say. So we might have some people who publish workspaces to FME server, but we might have somebody who has a more complex role there, for instance. So we sort of, adapt those roles to each organization. This will also, lend itself to what ends up being your literal permissions on the FME server. Next. Yeah.
A few resources here, Leslie, that we wanted to pull out. Again, these are all in the community, but the clear one there that's really interesting is FME server security. There's an overview there that can talk more about how you set up those roles and the actual how, because there are some key steps there that you want to think about. And then we have some good considerations for scaling there. And I think these links definitely relevant. And I'll throw it back to you for the next section there, Leslie.
Yeah. Oh, can you go back to Brian's slide? Yeah, people often ask me how I know what to install and what to configure on FME server, and I do have to say I read the administrator's guide on the FME server. I read the planning and installation guide. I review the security options, because in the last couple of years, for those of you who might not be aware, SAFE has added new options, such as like there's an option to change the encryption key on your FME server. There's some better guidelines on how to like encrypt the database password. There's different kinds of like options that are available there, and I think it's good to go through them and see which ones apply to your organization. So these to me are important systems. And the other thing I want to mention for system server host like sizing is that it is important to start with some sort of basic number. And I do want to point out, look at what your workspaces are going to do. It's definitely happened to me in the past that I had a client call me up and say, oh my God, we filled all the hard drive on our FME server. And I'm like, what happened? Well, I unpacked this like enormous raster. And I was like, well, you never really sized your FME server for raster processing, right? It's been chugging away doing some vector stuff for 10 years and then decided to, try to clip a raster that, unpacked itself in memory to like, I don't know, 300 gigs or something like that and filled the whole machine. So it's important to be sort of self-aware of what you've sized your FME server to do. All right, that's sort of what I want to add there. And so we talked about the technology part, and we talked about the people part. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the standards, guides, and practices. This is an exercise that we're doing more and more with clients. So I sort of divided it into three kind of components. There's sort of how we're going to manage our FME, how we're going to, guidelines for development, and sort of naming conventions and style guides. So we'll go next. So in style guides, so more and more, I would say people are developing sort of guides on how to use bookmarks to identify certain types of objects. Like if we look at the one in the graphic here, they're using sort of a brown color for input. So wherever we're reading data, we're using the green bookmark to identify that we're writing data, the red bookmark to identify that this is how we handle an error we might encounter. And what this does is it kind of gives a visual, like sort of almost cartography type impact, right? I can open a workspace that might have a lot of content in it, but I can see from a glance where data is coming in, where data is going out, and what kinds of things I'm finding. So they used purple for spatial manipulations and green, kind of cyanish color for attribute cleanup. We often do these exercises with the client, and we guide them through the process of, picking nomenclatures and styles. We'll make suggestions, but they'll often be the ones picking it because they're the ones who have to develop with it after. So it's often a combination of, recommendations with, sort of what they want to do. Man, I do have to say, Brian, like when I was developing these slides, I did not know the lizard was blinking. And I kept seeing it out of the corner of my eye, and I thought I was going crazy. And then I stared at the lizard long enough to see that he really is blinking. Sorry. But that really took me off.
It throws you off a little bit for sure.
It does, because all I see is he's winking at me constantly.
Yeah.
So we also develop sometimes for certain ones, we'll say like when and what to annotate. So just give some guides of like good practices of annotating. There's always a certain amount of interpretation, right? We don't want to make it so complex that, you know, it takes too long, but then, you know, a little bit of investment and some good documentation around your workspace, you'll be really happy with yourself in 6 months or a year from now. You know, or you'll be really happy with your colleague whose workspace you now have to edit because he's on vacation. So what are the benefits here? We see a consistent visual impact. It's easier to share between users, and it's faster to interpret a workspace. I have to do a lot of workspace interpretation. I have to do a lot of like getting a giant spaghetti and trying to understand what the workspace is doing. And definitely if the people have like applied some good practices, it's much faster to say where are the key pieces of processing happening and then sort of working out from there. We tend to take, if you look here, like we use like large annotations for high level pieces. So if you're zoomed out, you can see where their major processing steps are. And then as you zoom in, you see smaller annotations that identify, you know, when you're closer in, you see more detail about that specific section. And that we find a lot of clients have adopted sort of that methodology to annotation.
So there's another trick there, Leslie, which is the collapsible bookmarks idea too.
Oh,
Can
yeah,
take
I didn't
something
bring that
that's
up. Yeah.
just a massive workspace and really shrink it down. And if you're color coding that way, you can at a glance really understand what the purpose is, and that's super duper helpful.
Yes, actually, that's a really good point, and that you can collapse the bookmarks. And so for those of you who've been using FME for a long time, we used to do the same thing. We used to create custom transformers, but now we only really need to create custom transformers when we're really specifically trying to isolate a piece or process that we want to repeat multiple places or between different workspaces. So it's a lot more efficient to just collapse a section often. Yeah. Good point. We also tend to work through a lot of naming conventions. And so sometimes I got pushback on this from longtime FME desktop users because they would say, well, I know exactly which file geodatabase 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5 are. But I'm like, that's great. But when you publish your workspace to FME Server, it's no longer clear which source dataset file geodatabase 1, 2, 3, 4 point to. So we try to create an easy to, you know, read kind of nomenclature, and we use the type of elements we create a nomenclature around for desktop are usually the parameters, the readers and writers, the database and web connections, and the workspace names. So normally we try to have a convention around those things. These, I do want to point out, you don't have to go to the end of everything. It depends on how you want to work as an organization and a group. You know, you can start simple, you know, have some bookmarks and have some reasonable names, and then sort of develop your standard as you guys grow as an organization. And it's hard to have, I've been asked this question a lot of times, like, do you have recommendations? We have some basic recommendations for this stuff, but like if I look at what, you know, Brian calls a multi-tenancy FME server, which I love his term for it, which I've now adopted, where you have multiple separate groups of GIS people in different departments sharing one FME server platform, then the nomenclature tends to often be divided and starting around who owns the content, okay? But if I have just one little GIS department and they're serving out everybody else, then the nomenclature tends to turn around who they're serving or what the project is. So there's, you know, the strategies might change a little bit. You know, if you only have the GIS department, then you're not gonna put GIS in every repository name in your workspaces. But that means a lot if you have planning, GIS, and, you know, IT all using the same FME server. So there's different strategies based on that. And on the FME server, we create again, some strategies around the repositories and naming the automations. I find that for naming automations, for instance, I like to know what the main triggering event of an automation is. When I'm looking at a glance at my list of automations, it helps me see how many of them are webhooks versus schedules versus, so often we include the main triggering event in the name. Even though you can have more than one triggering event, I'm not talking about super complex scenarios, I'm talking about on average. And the apps on the projects. So all of those items have their particularities. Like for instance, repositories, we can't have a repository and a repository and a repository. So you do have to consider that. And also permissions are done at the repository level, not the FME workspace level. So because of that, you have to think about how you're going to group your workspaces in a repository, because anybody who gets access to it is going to get access to all the workspaces in that same folder. So these are important considerations. Next. And again, development practices. So how we use custom transformers, how we use custom coordinate systems and custom content, how we handle versioning. I'll only put one little line item there, but often like it can be like, how are we naming our versions of FME workspaces? It can be, how are we, are we using GitHub or something like that to manage versioning? So we have clients that do, all those things in all those spectrums, and it tends to be a bit of a scale thing, because the more automation and systems that you want to put into place around managing your workspaces and stuff, the more work it is to put that into place. So you have to balance that as to where you are and look at this more like an evolution. Your needs today in the next 12 months might evolve, and in 12 months from now you question, are you on a new path? Have you crossed the threshold where you have to consider these things? And then the move to production. This is something that Brian and I have had many conversations about. Depending on the client, I do have some clients that have created some automation. You can use REST calls and publish workspaces to FME Server. You could conceivably automate that, but it is some work to do. So you have to balance that against, do I just package my stuff into a project, move it over, make a few tweaks, and implement my stuff from development into production? Or do I really need a more, robust system where everything is automated and, appropriately develop the whole system that would go with that? So we, they each have different considerations. Next.
Okay, so I'm going to dive in here and just go into projects a little bit more in FME Server. I just wanted to show an example of building a project because they are, as Leslie said, really valuable for moving between different environments. But I think they're a bit of a hidden feature in FME Server at the moment. I don't know how many of our users are actually making use of this. So I'm just going to step out of our presentation slides now and jump into FME Server. So I'm in a 2021 version of FME Server. So if you are using a slightly older version, you will notice a slightly different color scheme. But projects have been around since 2017. So this is definitely something that should be available, hopefully, to most of you today as well. So in this example, I just want to show adding a gallery app and moving a gallery app from let's say a dev to a production environment. And the reason that I want to give an example of the gallery app is because this has a lot of things that it relies on in order to run successfully. So I'll just go and quickly show the gallery app that I'll be moving. So if you're not familiar with gallery apps, essentially they're a landing page for you to share a series of different workspace apps and also potentially other URL resources as well. So in this gallery app, this is a gallery app that my colleague Chris created for a webinar demo. And so within this, it's running a couple of different workspace apps, and these apps make use of things like web connections, different resources. And so when we are thinking about moving this from a development to a production environment, you can't just think about the workspace, you need to think of all the other components that it's using as well. So if we dive back into our FME server, you can create a project. On the left-hand side here, there's an option to build a project. And what we'll need to do first is give it a name. We can give it a description. And then there's also a README section as well, where I just like to usually list the components that this includes. So the different workspaces, connections, users, all of those different items. But I'll just do this for now so that we're not waiting for me to type all of that out. But there's kind of this metadata section here, and also the option to create different versions of a project as well as you grow. But the key thing that we want to do is we actually want to add items from our FME server into this project. And when I talk about projects, I'd say you can think of this as kind of like a backup and a restore, but you're only backing up kind of specific or selected items. So from here, you can basically select your automations, custom transformers or formats. You can include projects within projects. So all of your different items on FME server, you can basically go through and select what you want to be added into a project. So in this case, I'm going to add my server app. And at this point, all I've added is the app. I haven't added any of the workspaces or anything else. But FME Server is quite smart, and it's able to detect those dependencies. So in this case, it's able to see, okay, this workspace, this gallery app, sorry, includes 3 different workspace apps. So underneath each of those workspace apps, it includes the token to run that workspace app, the user that owns that app, the workspace itself, and also in this case, any of the connections being used within that workspace. So now I can go ahead and add all of the dependencies, or if perhaps I don't need the connection to be on my production server because it already exists, I can uncheck that and remove it. And then go ahead, and my project now has everything that I need in order to move this gallery app over to run in my second FME server. So at this point, I can just export it. And then once it's downloaded, I can jump over to my second FME server here and import the file. And then as soon as this is uploaded, that gallery app and all of its contents is going to be available to now be used on this FME server. So projects are just a really handy way to try and move different items from one FME server to another. As Leslie said, they come with their challenges. I think connections and swapping out connections is definitely one that's been raised with us. So if you do already make use of projects and you have any feedback, then please feel free to chat that out as well. But I just wanted to quickly dive into to show how easy it is to build a project. And now I will hand back to you, Leslie.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. And it is like projects, like when it makes sense, there is the way that we're using to move things from development to production. And what we did like in the process of doing that was that, the person who's the FME author, they're able to sort of pack it up and say, here's all the parts and pieces you need for my FME server. And so we know exactly what content to move over, which is nice. And then, when we look at FME management practices, we're just basically sitting down to make a plan of how do we track performance of the FME server, how do we prioritize, how do we handle planned outages, servers get patched, Services can go down, is there an impact? Is there not an impact? And a lot of that comes really down to risk management. We have sat down with some clients and really sat down and said, okay, what happens if this process goes down, and really done process by process or risk management? But sometimes it's more like overall, what happens if the services goes down? Who's responsible? And sort of just having a plan around that. The other thing I did want to mention at this point was, like, in the last couple of versions of FME Server, they've been coming out with, sorry, I just pointed at my child who's at the door. They've coming out with statistics that help us make those decisions for prioritization. So now we actually, sometimes you have to make them visible, those statistics. They're not necessarily visible in your window by default, but the average percentage of usage of CPU, average running time of your process, these things are really handy, especially for managing your schedules and different kinds of things. And you can get those averages, and that can help you make plans and provision for scaling. Next.
Okay,
oh,
so
yeah.
I'm going to dive in again just to talk about job metrics in a little bit more detail. So yeah, these are new as of 2021, and really we wanted to expose these statistics to help you make more quick, informed decisions about your job performance, and also to use these to help manage your load distribution. So the job metrics that we've made available are the elapsed time. So that's the total duration of your job run. And then we also have our CPU time and CPU percent. And this is particularly important when it comes to planning for dynamic engines, because you're being charged based on the amount of CPU usage of a workspace rather than the entire job duration. So when we talk about CPU, what I mean is the time that FME is actually doing work. So a lot of the time when a job is running, you're actually, our engines are actually just going to be sitting and waiting for something else to happen. So for example, data transfer across a network. If your database is located on the East Coast and your FME server is located on the West Coast, there's going to be a bit of a latency, a bit of time where the engines are just waiting to actually receive that data rather than doing any processing. And so you'll see that the CPU time is often much lower than the total job duration. And then the other statistic that we've exposed is peak memory usage. And we've calculate this for every job, and this is available on the jobs completed page, but we also keep track of a running average. And this is something that can be used in job queues to help route jobs to specific queues. So in FME 2021, in addition to these job statistics, we've also given job queues a complete facelift, and we've added some new functionality to give you much more advanced control over how your jobs are prioritized. So in FME Server 2020 and older, you are able to create job queues, and then you'd be able to assign a workspace repository to that queue, and also assign specific engines by their name to a specific queue. So this is quite restrictive. And so in FME 2021, we've actually broken this out into two separate sections. So firstly, we've enabled you to create job routing rules, which are going to determine which job is routed to a specific queue. So in addition to jobs belonging to a workspaces belonging to a specific repository, you can now route jobs to queues based on those job metrics. So if your job is running for a certain amount of time, you can send it to one queue or a different queue. And then the second set of rules we've enabled you to set is for engine assignment. So again, rather than just using engine names, you're now able to define queues according to engine properties. So this can include your host name, the operating system, the build number, and the engine type, so standard or dynamic engines. So again, I'm just going to step out of the presentation and do a quick demo. I know we are running slightly short on time. So hopefully I'll be able to speed through this and it will still make sense. So let me just dive into my FME server. So what I've got here is a FME server that's currently set on a trial license. So I have 2 standard engines, but this trial license also gives me 100 hours of dynamic engines. So I'd like to go ahead and start some dynamic engines, but I only want jobs which have a very low CPU time to be sent to those engines so that I'm not wasting my credits. So the first thing that I need to do here is actually start up some dynamic engines. And I can do that on this engine page of the web UI. And then at the top here, you'll see that I have my queues, and then I have job routing and engine assignment rules. So this is what's new in 2021. So the first thing I want to do is actually create a queue, and then I'm going to assign some rules to that queue. So already I have a couple of queues, which I'll talk about as well as we go through the other rules. But the first thing I just need to do is create a queue and give it a name, if I can spell. And I'm going to leave the priority at 5. We could change the priority here. And what that would mean is if an engine was assigned to multiple queues, one job would have priority over another one. Okay, so after I've created the queue name, the first thing I need to do is create my job routing rule. So I already have 2 rules here. The first one is for long-running jobs. And basically I'm saying all jobs that take longer than an hour to run, I want to be sent to a specific queue, because I don't want those jobs to be able to run on every engine and then block my entire FME server with jobs that are taking hours to run. I want to make sure there's engines still free to be running those quick jobs. And then the second job routing rule I've got is for my Esri job.
Holly, I believe we've lost your sound.
Oh no.
Oh, now you're back.
Yeah. Okay, where did I cut off?
Like
just as you spoke.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So sorry about that. Yeah, so the second job routing rule that I already have set up is just for Esri jobs, because they require access to an ArcGIS license. So I want to make sure that all of those jobs are getting routed to engines which have access to one of those licenses. So now I want to create a job routing rule for my dynamic engines. And I'm going to do this based on those job metrics that we talked about. So those CPU percent and time. So basically I'm saying if my CPU percent is less than or equal to 10%, or if my CPU time is, I should be doing less than, not greater than 10 seconds, then send it to my dynamic engines queue. And because we're calculating a running average, basically any jobs that have CPU less than 10% or time less than 10 seconds will go into my dynamic engine queue. And then the other thing I need to set is my engine assignment rules. So for that, I need to actually use my engine properties. So on our engines page, we can see all the different properties associated with the engines, so their type, their actual name, the host, and the build and the operating system. So in my existing rules, I already have one for my Esri jobs. And for this one, I'm using the property and I'm using the host name. And this is an express install, so it's only a single host. But imagine that you had distributed engines on your server which has your ArcGIS license. Then you could start to make use of this host to route those jobs. So again, I need to create my engine assignment rule, type property. It's already just by default, the dynamic property is selected, and I can assign that to my dynamic engines. So it's a little bit more of an advanced configuration, but at this point, I've now been able to set up a queue, that's going to monitor those metrics and route them to the dynamic engines if they fit those metrics. And if not, then they'll work their way through the rest of the list. And if they don't meet any of these rules, then they'll default to go into the default queue. So that was a very speedy walkthrough of queues. Anybody wants to see this in more detail, I'd suggest maybe booking a meeting with me another time during the World Fair. But yes, I'll leave it there for now, as I know we are over time. And I will pass back to you, Leslie. Oh,
yeah.
Actually, I'll just mention there's more resources, but we'll share this slide deck out afterwards so that you can access those.
Yeah, we're going to share the slide deck after, because like all these handy links that you guys have put has made sort of like a centralized sort of like things that you need to like ways to access all this information. So I guess I'll just finish really fast on security considerations. Basically, we have sort of three facets of security. We're kind of looking at user security, so meaning literally users using the FME server, the application security, so those security features on the FME server application, and sort of data security as well, which is really an important consideration. And it is one of the questions I ask when we're onboarding a new client with FME server, like what is the security level of the data so that we can make sure we're taking appropriate action for that sort of data. Next slide. I'm going to go very fast. So users, again, you know, who gets to be administrators, who gets to be authors, who gets to be users. Users can only execute content, but both authors and administrators can create content on the FME server. So, you know, these are considerations. We may need multiple author roles if we have a multi-tenancy FME server, so different groups who have access to different content. And one thing that I like to remind people is to actually keep that the original super user, when you install your FME server, keep the password somewhere safe. I've had some people accidentally lose access to their Active Directory. The IT people did not inform them ahead of time, make some changes, and then no longer be able to get into their FME server. So you need this user as kind of a backup. And I have a lot of people who forgot the password or forgot to put it in a password vault somewhere, or some guy left and they forgot the password. It happens all the time. Next. Also, application security. So again, I sort of mentioned review all the options that are there on FME server. They do evolve, new security features become available, and you should read up on them and see if they apply to your scenario. Next.
Okay, I think we'll just skip this demo and
Yeah, and then I'll just finish with data. Just be aware of user access to data. So in some sort of ways, like when I'm giving access to FME server, I'm giving access to certain kinds of data, either by running a workspace and extracting information, or as an author, being able to leverage things like database connections. So you do have to be aware that this is creating some sort of a door to data, and you should review that versus what your data policies already are for that. Next. I think that we, yeah, resources.
Yeah, I
Pavillion.
think we've reached the end now.
Yeah.
So
all right, guys. So thank you for all your patience. So the business needs are the main driver of your FME server. And like I said, it all like starts with doing a decent integration roadmap that helps you answer all the questions of how to implement your technology, how the people come into play using the FME server, and what kinds of standards and how you're going to leverage it. I think that it's, you know, like I said, it's all kind of driven by those things. And the more options there are with FME server available, like the dynamic engine stuff is super cool. It does answer a lot of questions that people have. But, you know, now we have to answer the questions of where do we deploy it? How do we deploy it? Now, like sky's the limit kind of. So you need to create, you know, you need to figure out what the business needs are, and then that helps you answer all the questions you need. All right, guys. Yeah, I think Brian, I saw you wrote in the chat.
I think if there's any questions, we're happy to stick around for a few minutes in the chat and answer those for sure. And you can tell we're really passionate about this topic. It's just something that is really, when you get started in it, there's a lot of considerations that you have to make, and that just shows you how valuable somebody like your team, Leslie, who's gone through these processes many times, that knowledge that you've built up is just invaluable. So again, yeah, talk to us, talk to our partners out there. We're always happy to help. And
yeah, and you guys that are our clients, like we have like Brian and Holly and I have had a lot of conversations over the past year, and basically we meet every 2 weeks and we talk about, you know, these sorts of things that, you know, we need in the future. Okay, what does FME server look like for deployment, for moving to production, for enterprise, for automations, for all these things are conversations we've been having over the past year. And as we deploy more and more FME servers with longevity in mind too, with the idea that you're not just installing it and off it goes, right? You're installing a thing that you manage now and installing a thing that has to be upgraded and migrated. And we sort of want to make a plan around that. Resources on metadata standards for the FME server. Do you guys have resources on your site around standards? Or, I mean, there's some best practices.
Yeah, I'm thinking I think this answers your question, but there's a best practices section in our training. It's linked in one of these slides here that goes through some of what you were talking about there, Leslie. You know, how animations, or sorry, annotations work,
or
and yeah, bookmarks and color schemes and all those things. I think best practices often come from the organization. So, you know, sitting down and looking at how do we want to scope this out so that everyone's on board. But we can definitely point you to that resource, the training for best practices, because it gets you all the right tips and tricks there. I can put it in the chat too.
Yeah, Holly, I don't know if you want to take this one. There's a question. We are moving towards scheduling, all scheduling towards automation. Some are quite full of triggers and actions. Why do automations need to be started and stopped?
Yeah, so once your automation is complete, you should be able to start it and then leave it running. But basically, while it's in a stopped state is while you're able to edit and author that automation. And then as soon as it's started is when it's actually running. So for example, directory watch, if you've added that trigger, once it's in a stopped state, FME won't be polling and looking at that directory. It's only going to start doing that once it's started. So it's about being able to edit, and then once it's running, it's running. You can't edit it anymore.
Yeah, I guess the question I would have, because I've built some of these with like clients over the past year, is like it would be kind of handy sometimes to just leave it running while you're sort of looking inside it and trying to figure out what you might change in the future. I mean, I kind of see that you could have do a save as and kind of like practice on the side and figure out what you want to change. But yeah, it's maybe along those lines. They like things.
Yeah, no, that's definitely is a valuable point. Yeah, I think you can duplicate and things. So I think maybe that would be a kind of workaround to be able to leave it up and running and be making edits until you're ready to then swap it over. And then you could stop one and start the new version. But yeah, right now, there's nothing for that. Definitely post it. I'd say post an idea on our community if you'd like that to see that functionality. Our product owners are in there often looking for ideas on what to do next.
Yeah. I don't know if did you guys answer all the questions that were in the chat? I see a lot of like, thanks, Brian. So Brian, you've been very active answering all the questions.
Yeah, there are some questions there about version control. And I mentioned something we're looking at, and I've seen demos of this, is workspace comparison tools, which is brilliant because I think that's the hardest part about using Git right now is you could save a workspace and it's slightly different and it's really hard to piece out what's different. So we're going to make that dead easy for everybody. And that's coming soon.
I think that would be actually great. That is one of the main questions I get when we're doing versioning. We did develop a tool at some point there, but like I kind of always thought that if you guys had something that would actually make the most sense. Like we had developed something where you could compare two workspaces and would throw out comments. But I mean, it is a complex thing once you start getting into, you know, buried content like a custom transformer instead of a custom transformer. But it would definitely be an interesting thing to know, especially since like right now, if you just move a transformer and no connections change, it's still considered a change, right?
Yep, that's right. And that's where it gets complicated in the traditional sense right now, but we'll make that a lot easier. There's another question here from Vivian, monitoring.
I can speak to this one a bit. We actually have an article that I'll share. So there's nothing. So in FME Server, we have dashboards, and we do provide some basic workspaces that will call our REST API to extract information about jobs, and then just generate some really simple HTML reports. And those are completely customizable, and also you can use the REST API to kind of build your own reports as well. So all of those job statistics that I showed today, they're all available through the REST API. And the specific article that Brian just shared kind of walks through some examples of some graphs and tables and visuals that you might be able to build using that REST API. But I also know customers that have fed the REST API into other BI tools such as Tableau, if they want to build kind of more complex dashboards as well. It's also something that is on our radar to try and build in kind of a better monitoring dashboard for administrators. It's a conversation that's kind of just been kickstarted within the FME Server development team. So hopefully we might have some better solutions for this in future versions as well.
Yep, that's actually good to know, because like that is a question that I get often as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, thanks for everybody who hung on because they want to know the answers to the questions. And I just want to say thanks to Brian and Holly. Like, we've had so many numerous conversations over the past year, and sort of, you know, the idea of this presentation was sort of to start this conversation about how do we look at FME Server, like from our enterprise point of view or our corporate point of view, and what are the main elements of that, because there's so much to cover. There's everything from the IT part to the people to the standards. So it was meant to sort of be an introduction and an overview to something that I think is the beginning of a, you know, I think like a new topic in the world of FME, maybe like how do I implement my FME server? How do I manage it in the future? So maybe like it's a future direction possibly for content and, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. It's been really valuable for us as well to learn from you, Leslie. And obviously, I think that the takeaway is that there really are no hard set rules for when it comes to doing any of these things, and it is down to your business needs. But just to you know, start asking yourself those questions and allowing yourself to be adaptable is going to be really valuable when it comes to deploying FME Server.
Yeah, and providing feedback too. Providing feedback to who you're working with or directly to us is just so helpful and makes the products way better.
Yep. For sure. All right, guys, thank you very much. And like, I guess till next time.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you so much,
Enjoy
everybody.
the rest of the
Bye,
World
guys.
Fair.